LinkedIn presents.
I'm Michael Kovnat, and this is The Next Big Idea. Today, how to predict anything. Now, what would you say if I told you that I'd found a single theory that explains everything? Get a grip, Michael? That's nice, dear. No, most likely you wouldn't say anything, but you'd simply give me a wide berth as you walked past me quickly, and you'd have good reason because monomyths and grand unified theories are the stuff of conspiracies and the province of kooks. But then again, what if I put a little more meat on the bone and I said I had a theory that explained everything from evolution by natural selection to good poker strategy, from presidential elections to Super Bowl outcomes, from today's weather to how AI works to human consciousness itself? And what if I said that theory could be summed up in just a handful of symbols, in a formula made up of just about a dozen characters invented by an obscure 18th century Presbyterian minister who died without publishing it? Well, then you might be more likely to say, Michael, prove it. All right, so let me try. Today, I'm chatting with Tom Chivers, author of the new book, Everything is Predictable: How Bayesian Statistics Explain Our World. Now wait, don't press that skip button yet. I know the word statistics might be yawn-inducing for some of you and trauma-inducing for others. So let me reframe it for you. What Tom and I are going to be talking about is how to see into the future. Fortune-telling, prophecy. That sounds juicier, right? Tom is an award-winning British science journalist who's written for the Times of London, The Guardian, New Scientist, and Wired, among other publications. His previous books include The Rationalist's Guide to the Galaxy and How to Read Numbers. Now, my team was worried that this conversation might devolve into a bunch of math talk, but I wanted to sit down with Tom because I wanted to understand what it means when my weather app says there's a 10% chance of rain tomorrow, or when 538.com says Joe Biden has a 53% chance of being reelected. That number is from yesterday, by the way. After all, we live in a world where things either happen or they don't happen. They don't 10% happen. Now, maybe this sounds dumb to you, but I've never thought it was perfectly clear what it is we're doing when we try to capture the future in percentage form. Tom didn't think I was dumb. He thought my questions made good sense, and he had answers for them.
The LinkedIn Podcast Network is sponsored by NICE. NICE Enlighten, the only AI purpose-built for CX, delivering trusted customer interactions across any channel, anytime. Learn more by visiting nice.com/CX-AI-now.
Tom Chivers, welcome to The Next Big Idea.
Thank you very much. Good to be here.
I predict with a probability of 0.8 that this will be a good conversation. I can't.
Thank you very much.
I learned from your book that I shouldn't, have total confidence in any particular outcome. But that doesn't mean that all outcomes are equally likely, right? So I'm going to go with 0.8.
0.8 is good. You give me a 1 in 5 chance of crashing and burning, but broadly speaking, you like the look of me. That's fine. Okay, I'll take that.
Good. Now, if you don't mind, I'd like to tell you when I first got interested in this question of probability, or when I first realized that I had no idea what it was all about. And that was back in 2016 on November 8th. It was election day. And I woke up that morning and, like millions of people, I checked my 538.com election forecast. And it told me that Hillary Clinton had a 71.4% chance of winning the presidency. And that was lower than it had been in the week or two prior, but still that seemed pretty strong. So I kind of went about my day with that as, my background assumption. Mm-hmm. Well, it turns out that Donald Trump did get that 1 out of 3 chance, and he ended up winning. And I remember saying to myself, okay, well, what did that even mean then to say that someone has a 71% chance? I mean, people were criticizing Nate Silver, who's the man behind 538.com, and he said, well, I never said she had 100% chance. I said 71%. So this was a perfectly reasonable forecast. But to me, then I was like, well, what's the point of forecasting things? And to say that she has a 71% chance, does that mean if the election were run 100 times, she would win 71 of them? And how is that even a meaningful thing to say? So I found the whole thing baffling. Now, can you convince me that this kind of forecasting is a real thing and not just okay?
Yeah, I think I can. So what does it mean to say this one-off thing has a X percentage chance of happening? What Nate Silver would say is, if he makes lots of predictions and you can look at the things he says are 60% likely, and you can see whether they come in 60% of the time, and you can see the things that come in 80%, do they come in 80% of the time? And if they do, then he is what forecasters would call well calibrated. That doesn't mean that if you ran the 2016 election a million times, it would happen exactly that way, 71% of the time, whatever, because he can't do that. Right. But it does mean that his subjective best guess of the probability of things happening is pretty good.
Right.
And that's the fundamental, that's the sort of the insight of Bayes' theorem of modeling probability in the Bayesian way, is that probability isn't some truth about the world. When we say the coin I flip is 50% likely to come up heads, I'm not saying there's some deep platonic truth about coins that make them 50-50 in some way. I'm saying my best prediction, I can't do better than 50-50 because I don't know how hard you flicked it. I can't predict the air resistance on the coin as it spins. So I can't do better than 50-50. So that's why it is, from my subjective point of view, is 50-50.
Right.
So the idea of Bayesianism is that probability is your subjective best guess about the universe. So that and they can be better or worse. Do you understand the distinction I'm making?
Yeah. So to say that someone has a 71% chance of winning an election, you're not saying anything true about the state of the world or the facts of that election, so much as you're putting a number on your ignorance or your how much knowledge or lack of knowledge you have. You're just trying to kind of assess it. Yeah.
But that's not the same as saying it's made up. It can be better or worse. Right. Yeah.
It's not a random guess. Some guesses are better than others, but 100% certainty is never even part of the equation. I think you say
it's not really possible. No.
And I think I like the framing in your book. You sort of talk about predicting the future. And, if someone came up to me and said, I can predict the future, I would say, oh, they're probably a charlatan of some kind. We can't see into the future, but we can sort of, we can see a bit into it. In fact, we do that all the time, right? You said we predict the sun is going to come up tomorrow. I predict my keys are going to be where I left them. And then I have to I'm more confident about the sun coming up than I am about my keys being where I left them. But there's this constant kind of prediction that we do. It's part of being alive. It's part of being human and maybe just being an animal.
Yeah, if you couldn't predict the future, what's your brain doing? What's the sort of point in it? I predicted that when I logged onto the Riverside link you sent me for this podcast, there'd be someone on the end of it to interview me. We arranged the future to our own specifications when we arranged to have this conversation, and I predicted your actions and you predicted mine, and it was successful. We are here talking to each other.
Yeah.
We are constantly making predictions of the world, better and worse. Some things are easier to predict than others. You're right. The sun coming up tomorrow, we can predict that very accurately for millions of years because the orbit and spin of the planets is very mechanistic, not much chaos in it, so it's very predictable. You can predict eclipses for 4,000 years, when the next eclipse will be in Michigan, I don't know. But if you want to predict the weather, you're kind of screwed if you try whether it will rain in Michigan or London or anywhere 3 weeks from now. That's much harder. And your prediction will always be very noisy and you end up probably just have to say, well, it rains about 1 day and 3 in London, so let's say about 1 in 3 chance. But we can predict the future all the time. Do you see what I mean? We have to. It's just not. It's not mystical. It's not like some magical vision. It's just we are good at using. Well, it's often good at using the information available to us through our senses and making predictions of the world using it.
I am always fascinated by the weather forecasts, and when they say, for example, sometimes they'll say there's a 50% chance of rain, and I always think, can that really be right? That it's a coin flip whether it's going to rain or not? It's not more likely one or the other. I guess what's happening is they're saying in the model, they have when these conditions are like they are now, half of the time it did rain and half of the time it didn't. So therefore, we're going to say 50%.
They're looking at millions of days with this sort of pressure and this sort of wind conditions and this sort of cloud cover. And they're saying on days like that in London or wherever, we've seen rain in this many places. It is a bit more complicated than that because you're not just dealing with whether it will rain, but also if you say to someone, it's not going to rain on your 30% likelihood, and then it does rain, they get much more annoyed about that than they do if you say it might rain and then it doesn't. So they have to sort of deal with human psychology as well as the simple fact. You don't just, 49% is not a chance of rain, we'll say it won't rain. It has to be a bit more like we have to work out what advice people will take from this.
Is this sort of thing something you've always been interested in? How did you get interested in Bayes and probability and all that?
So I remember in the early 2000s in a British newspaper called The Guardian, there was a guy called Ben Goldacre who used to write these columns called Bad Science. And it was about ways in which the media misrepresented science and all sort of stuff. One of the things he kept coming back to was this equation, which like if you get a medical test that says you're 95%, it's 95% accurate medical test, and you get a positive result on it, doesn't that mean you're 95% likely to have the disease? And he said, no, there's this thing called Bayes' theorem, which actually, it sounds like it's ivory tower nonsense, but it just straightforwardly means you don't know how likely you are to have the disease unless you know how likely you were to have it before. And it felt so counterintuitive and sort of quasi-magical. It really stuck with me. And this is really difficult to get your head around, but it's so unarguable when you follow the numbers. It was then I started to realize that it really applies in all sorts of different situations. It's not just in medical testing. You see it in the book I talk about it in the law. It applies in all science. How whether or not we judge the likelihood that a scientific hypothesis is correct. That can be described through Bayes' theorem, and fundamentally it is the sort of the basis of all decision theory. When any agent in the world makes a decision, the extent to which it is a good decision is the extent to which it is correctly approximating Bayes, and the extent to which it isn't is the extent to which it isn't, right? So I just got more and more interested in it. So I just became obsessed. And now I've written a whole book on the thing.
I mean, the title of your book is Everything is Predictable. So you found something here that you think has some sort of universality to it. Is that right, that everything is predictable?
I think it is true that everything is predictable to some extent, right? There is some things that are harder to predict, and your predictions will be less certain. I mean, like we were just talking about, my prediction that it will rain tomorrow will be less certain than my prediction there'll be a solar eclipse whenever, because of the added chaos in the system. But nonetheless, I can make predictions, and I can put some percentage probability on whatever these things happening. So yes, I can make a prediction about, I think, almost anything. So everything is predictable, and the maths of prediction is Bayes.
Well, I want to get into who Thomas Bayes was and what his theorem says. But to get there, let's just talk about the origins of this whole way of looking at the world, which, when I'm talking about elections and weather, it seems like these very complex systems. But I love the fact that probability has its origin sort of in the lowly world of gambling, really, right? Because that's where people first got really interested in, like, how many times will a 6 come up when I throw dice? Or how many times will I get a high card in Texas Hold'em? And in that context, it's understandable that, as opposed to the elections or the weather, it's kind of a system where, first of all, it happens over and over again. You're going to throw the dice many, many times. So you do have like a body of information to work off of. And it's very important to get it right if you want to make money at the gambling table. So the stakes are high. And in that context, it seems interesting to me that as you explain it, out of this world, a bunch of sort of gamblers and hobbyist mathematicians just started to try to quantify, what's a good bet and what's a bad bet. Can you give me a little bit of that backstory on how probability became a science?
Yeah, of course. So, I mean, like everything good in the world, it begins in low-down French gambling houses in the 16th century, a bunch of aristocrats throwing dice somewhere in there. And anyway, the first sort of formulation of probability theory as we think of it today. All the stuff done in school, right? Yeah, exactly that. You throw 3 dice, what are the chances of seeing 3 sixes and all that sort of stuff. That was really, it was these two very famous French mathematicians, Blaise Pascal and Pierre de Fermat. They were asked by a mutual friend who was a massive, basically a gambling addict as far as we'd probably call him today. But they were asked to work out, imagine you're playing a game, 2 of you, and let's keep it maximally simple. It's a game of flipping a coin. First person to 3 points wins, and you're at 2 points each. What's the fairest way to split the pot? And they worked out the sort of insight that is that it's not about who's got how many points or anything like that. It's about how many outcomes there are that are left, and in what percentage of those outcomes one person wins over the other. So if it's 2 points each and you only need one, then it's 50-50. If it's 2-1, then in 3 out of the 4 outcomes, then the guy with 2 points will win, and so on. So that's the sort of fundamental insight. But what this is it's taking a hypothesis, and saying how likely am I to see this result? So if we assume this dice game is fair, or this coin toss is fair, how likely am I to see this result, that this guy wins, or that the coin comes up heads, or the dice comes up 6, whatever, which is useful for gambling. But if you're a statistician or a scientist, it's not actually what you want. You don't want to say, if I posit that the game is fair, how likely am I to see this particular result? What you want is the opposite. What you want is, given this data that I've seen, I've just done a COVID vaccine trial, say, and in my placebo arm, 10 people got COVID, and but the people who actually had the vaccine, only 1 person did. I could tell you how likely I am to see that result if I assume that the vaccine doesn't work. Pascal and Fermat could have done that with their maths that they worked out. But what a statistician or a scientist wants to do is say, all right, given that I've got that result, how likely is my hypothesis to be true? Do you see the distinction?
Yes.
Between how likely am I to see this result given a hypothesis versus how likely is my hypothesis to be true given a result?
Okay, so we've got Pascal and Fermat, and they're kind of developing some theories and some science of probability. And then how does Thomas Bayes come into the picture? Who was he?
So Thomas Bayes was an 18th century, well, not a priest. He was a minister in a little town called Tunbridge Wells outside London, and today we'd call him a hobbyist. He was a well-off guy from a well-off family, and he'd got this fairly undemanding job of running a small nonconformist chapel in a tourist town outside London, and he fell in with this circle of mathsy, sciencey nerds, and his great insight, which was published posthumously. He didn't seem to think that much of it during his own lifetime because he never tried to get it published. He probably could have done. His great insight was that in order to turn what we've just talked about, what we're called sampling probabilities, that how likely am I to see this result given a hypothesis, into what we want, which is how likely is my hypothesis to be true given this result that I've seen, you need to take into account your prior probabilities, which is a fancy technical term for what you already thought. And that was the great insight that allows you to say, this is how likely my hypothesis is to be true. But it was immediately controversial and remains controversial for 300 years later because it's subjective. Science at that point was like trying to make everything an objective, they hoped we could just say, this is just how likely something is to be true. This is just the case from the data. But Bayes' theorem just says, no, that's not true. You have to use your own best guess, your own information, your own subjective probabilities to say anything about the world. And that's really uncomfortable. It sort of becomes this sort of squishy, anything could be true. And as we said, it's not as straightforward as that. There are better and worse guesses, and it's about how well your guesses predict the world. But nonetheless, it introduces a lot of subjectivity, and people are very, very uncomfortable with that.
Right. So that's the key insight, that our priors, our prior assumptions have to be calculated into the equation when we're predicting something. And that gets to the point you were making, because what we're describing is not some truth about the world. We're saying a truth about our own knowledge, about our own abilities, our own thinking. So we're to analyze our thinking, we need to know what we are thinking at the beginning of the analysis. And, I think I started to get a little clearer on this Bayesian insight when I thought about multiple predictions, when you're not just doing one test, but you're then taking the information you get from that test. That gives you a new set of priors, and then you improve your next guess, right? So that it's iterative in that sense. And that if you are doing this technique of taking the things you learn, which I think you call your posteriors, and they become...
Yes, your posterior. Everyone has to snigger at that. Yeah, everyone goes chuckle. Yeah.
And then you make that, you factor that in. So that starts to look a lot like learning and making more and more accurate predictions. And as you say, I think the same people who are fascinated with this stuff are some of the people involved in artificial intelligence. And you say that AI and these large language models that we're so excited about now are essentially working on that Bayesian principle. Could you explain that a bit?
I mean, the example I always use is if I type into ChatGPT, "How are you?" it will say to me something like, "I'm very well, thank you." That is not because it is very well, I assume, but because it has seen vast amounts of data, and in that vast amounts of data, the string "how are you" is usually followed by something like "I'm very well, thank you," or "fine, cheers," or something like that. It's rarely followed by strings like "duck-billed platypus." I don't know. It knows the sort of thing that follows it. So it's making that prediction. Now, if you'd done the same thing before you'd given ChatGPT however many terabytes of data it was trained on, if you just said "how are you" to the untrained model, it wouldn't have had anything to base its prediction on, and might have returned duck-billed platypus or a random sequence of X's and J's and whatever. It couldn't make a good prediction because it had no data. So its prior prediction was, at first, any string could follow that string "how are you?" But as it got more data into its system, its sort of probability mass, if you like, its probability distribution narrowed ever more onto things like "I'm very well, thank you." And that's exactly the process. So of Bayesianism, you have your prior, which is you can imagine as a curve on a graph. This is the sort of how the things I expect to happen are in this curve on the graph, and then you get some more information. And if it's very like it's a similar curve on the graph to the one you had, then your curve stays the same or gets narrower and pointier. Or if it's somewhere else, then you have to move your curve and it shifts along to somewhere else because your prediction doesn't match what happens. And that's exactly what AIs are doing. They are predicting the world and training on new information to get better and better guesses.
Yeah, and so I've heard some people be a bit dismissive about ChatGPT by saying, well, it's just fancy autocomplete, right? It's not thinking, it's just guessing, how you want to complete that sentence.
Just predicting. Drives me mad.
Well, maybe that's what thinking is, right? Because maybe that might be similar to how we think, that maybe when I start to form a sentence in my head or verbally out loud, I'm kind of predicting what word comes next, and then how I'm predicting what you're going to say, and I'm auto-completing. I'm just auto-completing all the time.
A good way of showing someone that you understand what the point they're getting at is to sort of complete their sentence for them. So that is absolutely what we're doing. I will also say that it's just autocomplete. It's just predicting the next thing. It drives me mad. You can put the word "just" before anything, right? He's just running the 100 meters in 9.6 seconds. He's just flying by flapping his arms. The word "just" doesn't make it unimpressive on its own. And predicting the world is really hard. And that's why humans who are very good at predicting much of the world have overtaken a large part of it. And we make more complicated and subtle predictions than much of the rest of it. We predict that when we smelt iron in certain ways, we can make steel and all this sort of stuff. We've learnt from the past, and we can use it to predict the future in these impressive ways. And there is also interesting evidence showing that ChatGPT is not just predicting surface statistics, but in order to make good predictions of the world, you want to build a model of the world, right? Like, if to predict how a car will behave, the better your model of how a car works, the better your predictions of it will be. And there is evidence from a couple of papers that ChatGPT and transformer-like models like ChatGPT are building models of the world, which they then use to make predictions, not simply making predictions like this is the most likely string following this. And that's what you'd expect, because they're really good at making predictions.
Yeah.
And the best way to make predictions is to make a model of the world.
Isn't that interesting? I find it fascinating that we don't quite know how they work, even though they are human creations, that they're so complex that even the people who build them are like, I don't know, maybe they're making a model, maybe they're not. That's just a fascinating detail. Let's just go back to Bayes for 1 minute.
It is fascinating.
We don't know that much about Bayes, and I think part of that's because he was a nonconformist, which means he wasn't part of the Church of England, which meant they didn't really keep birth records and other important details. He was a little bit off the radar, but he somehow came up with this formula, which you think is sort of do you call it the most important formula anyone's ever come up with?
I'd call it, I'd say it's the most important one-line equation of all time. I mean, it's not the most famous. I mean, E equals MC squared is more famous, but but I do think it has wider application. I mean, I suppose you could argue that E equals MC squared lets us blow stuff up with, and maybe end the world and also create nuclear power stations. So you could make different arguments, but I do think it describes such a wide array of things.
I would point listeners to your book to see the theorem as it's written out with the letters and symbols. But I suppose maybe we should, would you be able to kind of summarize what the formula is, maybe as it would be said in English?
Well, let's see if I can do it off the top of my head, shall we? Okay, so the probability of my hypothesis being true, H, given the data, D, so PH given D is equivalent to the probability of D given H times the probability of H divided by the probability of D. I think that, and so is that clear? Can I go home now? Is that everything you need? What it's saying is the probability that your hypothesis is true, given some new result, some new scientific result or a medical test or whatever, relies not just on how likely your test is to be true, but also on how likely it was to be true beforehand. I mean, that's really what we've been talking about the whole time. So if you do, for example, I mean, I've been trying to work on ways of making this nice and intuitive for people over the radio, because it's such a, it's quite straightforward when you look at it in a diagram, but it can be a bit of a bugger to explain verbally. But I suppose one way I've been trying to do help sort of intuition pump for it might be that if imagine that Tom Chivers, did a test for a medical condition, right? And we know that it is that 99 times out of 100, if you've got this condition, it'll correctly tell you so. And if you haven't, 99 times out of 100, it'll correctly tell you that you haven't, So 99% specific and 99% sensitive is how I would describe it, And I do the test, I get a positive result. What's the chance that I have the condition,
And naively, I would think the answer is 99%. You're 99% likely to have it.
Of course, yeah. But now if I say, but my big reveal, right? It's a pregnancy test. What's more likely, that I, Tom Chivers, age 43 and conspicuously male, am pregnant, or that this is the 1 in 100 times that it's that the test got it wrong? And I think most people would say the pregnancy is less likely, right? But you can't just say, you have to take into account your prior probability that this guy is pregnant, right? So, I mean, what you can do it more formally. You can say, like, you have a test that's 99% sensitive and specific, and you take 10,000 people, but say you're testing for a rare cancer that only one person in 1,000 has. So there are 10 people who have the cancer. Your test will probably detect all 10 of them. But it will also probably give you about 100 false positives, because 1% of 10,000 is about 100. So given that, if your prior probability is 1 in 1,000 and you take this 99% accurate test, then afterwards, if you get a positive result, your posterior probability is probably about 9%, I think. I think that's about right off the top of my head, that you've actually got it. And so your 99% accurate test has a better than 9 out of 10 chance of giving you the wrong answer if you get a positive result. And that I don't know about you, but that still feels sort of uncanny to me and weird, but it just falls out of the numbers. It's just very, and that's why I try. I sometimes, I'm never sure if it works, and you can tell me if it does. But I feel like the pregnancy test example. Oh right, yes, obviously.
Yes.
You have to take into account how likely I thought it was in the first place, and that's very unlikely. So I'm going to go with maybe the test has got it wrong this time as the more likely hypothesis.
Right. You have to somehow quantify how likely middle-aged men are to be pregnant is part
Yeah.
of your calculation, right? That has to, so
exactly.
your assumptions have to be figured into it. I mean,
Yeah.
yeah, it is. It's a little tricky to get your head around in some ways, but as you say, it does when you start sort of thinking in this Bayesian way, you start to see it everywhere. And I was especially fascinated by some of the later chapters in your book where you start to explore Bayesian theories of consciousness, for example, the Bayesian brain, you say. This is not the way we've always understood how the brain works or how consciousness works, but maybe you could say a little bit more about now how at least some theorists and researchers and neuroscientists are trying to understand the way what we are doing constantly is building models, making predictions, updating those models, making new predictions. How does that work in terms of my everyday life? Or in terms of biology, even like what do we think is happening inside the brain that might make it Bayesian?
So it feels from the inside, right, like we're seeing the world like through a window, doesn't it? We sort of perceive a 3D model of the world, the world in 3D and color all around us. We know that can't be true, though, because we know that, just sticking with vision, like the light that hits our retinas is filtered, our retinas are lumpy and covered in blood vessels. Only the very center of them can see color and focus. Actually, like if you were to hold a playing card up behind you and you didn't know what color it was, and then you move it into your vision, you wouldn't be able to tell whether it was red or black until it was pretty much slap bang in the middle of your vision. There's a blind spot which your brain is constantly filling in somewhere off a few degrees to the to either side of your the center of vision, which is where the blood vessels disappear through your retina. If your brain was just taking the information from your senses, then your vision would be of this weird, lumpy, distorted, curved world with a little bit of color in the middle and black and white everywhere else and really fuzzy. Also, the signals travel from along your nerves surprisingly slowly, a few hundred miles an hour. They maybe less than 100 miles an hour actually. And so, like if you were to knock a pen off your desk, by the time the signals get from your eyes to your brain down to your arm and you try to catch it, you'd be about 5 centimeters, a couple of inches above where the pen would be by the time it had started falling. Right. You cannot just be seeing the world. It cannot be pure bottom-up information coming in.
And if nothing else, it would be chaos. It would just be this riot of light and color. And of course, that's not my experience. And I can catch that pen. So clearly, my reality is something different than just a pure sensory input.
Exactly. And so what your brain is doing, and this has been demonstrated quite neatly, is building a model of predictions of the world. When I look away from the coffee cup on my desk, I predict that it remains there. And when I look back there, I see it there, I'm not surprised, so I don't update my world. So I almost don't notice it, Whereas if I make some prediction, I think the example in the book is of a coffee cup again, because whenever someone's writing these things, they're always at their desk and there's always a coffee cup there. For example, I see the coffee cup out of the corner of my eye. That is where I predicted it. I reach down for the coffee cup to take a swig. I grab it, and the coffee cup, instead of being hot and heavy like I expect, is cold and light because I drank my coffee hours ago. And so, oh no, my prediction is false. My brain has to update its predictions with new information and then build a new model update its model of the world to now there is no coffee or in that coffee cup. I need to go make a new cup of coffee. And that seems to be what we're doing. That's like we can describe what the brain does quite well by treating it as essentially a bottom-up plus top-down system where the brain makes predictions of the world, sends those predictions down to lower-level bits of itself, which then are then updated with information coming up from the senses. And this works very well as a model of the brain, as I understand it. And there are some great specific predictions that fall out of it. Like one idea is that schizophrenia can be described partly as a pathologically weak, underconfident predictions of the world. So that all that stuff like the blood vessels in our retinas and all that sort of stuff, and the blood moving in them, that sometimes makes our vision slightly like move when it's coming to the brain. And most of us would just say walls don't move, Ignore that,
Right.
cancel that out. And when my strong prediction of walls don't move will override that noisy data coming from my senses. So just forget that, ignore it. Schizophrenics don't have such strong predictions, so they overweight the information coming from their senses, and they do get things like hallucinations, delusions.
Mhm. Some people report hearing voices. And of course, we all hear voices. We hear our sort of internal monologue, but the neurotypical among us sort of understand that as not a real external voice. But if I don't have a strong prior on that, then I might take that same bit of data and go, someone's talking to me right now. And that could approximate the schizophrenic experience.
Exactly that. Mm-hmm. So when our brain makes predictions, and then when the predictions are met by reality, it sort of subtracts the predictions from reality. So that we just sort of forget the whole, okay, that's just what we expected. It seems less. So when actually the tickling is very much part of this. The hypothesis is we can't tickle ourselves because we can predict it so well that we just sort of, our brain sort of we can feel it, but our brain subtracts the prediction away from our experience. It's just, okay, that's just what we expected. Forget it. Don't worry about it, because we can predict those movements so precisely. And one small study found that schizophrenics could tickle themselves and the hypothesis is this is because their predictions of where their fingers are going to be are weaker and less confident, because their overall predictions of everything are less confident. And the same way, when a thought comes into my mind, that's sort of predicted by my mind in some sense. And so I say, okay, so that just feels like me. It feels like I'm in control of that because it was something I did and predicted. Whereas to someone who has these weaker predictions, the voice comes as though unbidden, as though sort of separate from themselves and was unpredicted, and therefore has the strong sensation of being someone else's. When we talk about using psychedelic drugs for antidepressants and things like that as antidepressants, that's built on the same model that depression could be seen as overly strong predictions about your own worth and state and the world and all that sort of stuff, overly strong negative predictions that you can't then get out of. And the idea is that psychedelic drugs temporarily weaken those predictions, allowing you to get out of some dip of, some unfortunate dip of predictions into somewhere where it's more truthful. And that sounds very helpful and useful, but it also could be that people are looking for things too keen to see things they want to see there. So I'd like to see more research done.
Yes, we have to be careful even now discussing this, because these are all new and somewhat untested, still unproven theories. But just to make sure I understand at least the model, the theory around depression, it would be that if I'm depressed, one thing that might be going on is I have a very strong prior assumption that I'm no good, that life is boring, that my work is meaningless, whatever it is. And then even as people tell me, no, you're great, I love you, or I get some feedback that life is actually interesting, I can't overcome my prior assumptions because they're too strong, they're kind of out of balance. And that a feature of psychedelics, so that first of all, that's a model of depression which may or may not be accurate. And then psychedelics, one of the functions, or one of the ways they work is that they kind of lower our prior assumptions and make us more sensitive to the incoming data, right? So that, I think you described it in the book, it's the, oh wow, have you ever really looked at a tree, man? Experience, like when you're when you're a little bit high and you just can't believe how interesting the world around you is.
It's like looking at your hands. God, have you ever? Exactly.
Yeah. And that, I mean, it's easy to sort of laugh at that a little bit, but what you are doing is you're seeing things afresh, right? You're seeing the world having turned down all of your internal assumptions, having opened up your model to new information. That's a fascinating way of looking at it.
It is fascinating. And I mean, this sort of, to sort of complete the model as best I can, the sort of way they describe it is you can imagine yourself as as like a landscape of belief in which, you want to get into the, where truer beliefs that predict the world the best. You can picture them as like deep valleys on this landscape. The truer the belief, as in the better it predicts the world, the deeper the valley. And what depression is in this model is you get stuck in a a deep valley that you can't get out of with you need evidence to get up the hill into the next valley, and you haven't got because this one is so steep, even though the next valley is even deeper and truer and predicts the world better, you can't get out of the one you're in because you can't get enough evidence to push you over that little hill. And that in this model, in this three-dimensional, this model of the world, the psychedelics flatten the landscape, make the valleys less deep and the hills less high, and it just means your little belief car can just get over into the next valley more easily.
The LinkedIn Podcast Network is sponsored by NICE. NICE Enlighten, the only AI purpose-built for CX, delivering trusted and complete customer interactions across any channel, anytime. Built on a unified cloud platform and leveraging the world's largest labeled dataset of omni-channel CX interactions, Enlighten is the only AI for CX that delivers trusted and accurate results. Learn more by visiting nice.com/CX-AI-now.
Hey, I'm Michael Kovnat, host of The Next Big Idea Daily. The show is a masterclass in better living from some of the smartest writers around. Every morning, Monday through Friday, we'll serve up a quick 10-minute lesson on how to strengthen your relationships, supercharge your creativity, boost your productivity, and more. Follow The Next Big Idea Daily wherever you get your podcasts. I want to quickly tell you about the Next Big Idea Club's book box subscription. Every quarter, we get our friends Malcolm Gladwell, Adam Grant, Susan Cain, and Daniel Pink to pick the 2 best new works of nonfiction, and then we send them to our subscribers. If you sign up, you'll also get access to beautiful audio and video e-courses, invitations to exclusive AMAs with top authors, membership in our LinkedIn community, and VIP access to our live events. Plus, you'll be helping us continue to make this show. So if any of this is interesting to you, go to nextbigideaclub.com to learn more. And if you do end up subscribing, use the promo code PODCAST at checkout to get 20% off. That's nextbigideaclub.com, promo code PODCAST. I think you say early on in your book, life is not a game of chess. It's more like a game of poker. In other words, we don't live in a world where all the information is on the surface available to us. There's a lot of hidden information. There are a lot of down cards. And to play the game of life, we have to guess and predict to survive. That's what we're doing all the time. And that gets me to this question, which you get into sort of towards the end, which is to see Bayes and Bayesian thinking in our understanding of what evolution is, how natural selection functions. And let me see if I've got this right. So in a sense, the same way that we make predictions, we have our priors, we make our predictions, and then we update them in a much slower, more drawn out way. Natural selection it has its priors in the sense of our genes, and these are kind of like nature's best guess of what we're going to need to survive in this world. Then it runs the experiment through a generation, and some of those go wrong and those die off, and what's left becomes sort of the updated set of priors, and the next generation then sort of runs the experiment again. And by doing this, generation after generation, we get the amazing variety of life that we see around us.
Yeah, no, that is. I'll slightly tighten your language up, I think, and say I think the way to think of it is that the frequency of a gene in a population counts as the prediction. Do you know what I mean? So if like there's lots of genes going around for sharp teeth and strong jaw muscles, that's prediction that the species in which that gene is widely spread around is going to live in a place with lots of antelope or something for it to kill. And also that the species itself, that it's going to be in a body with lots of other genes, that will help it do that. Like that it'd be no use if it's in a body, a gene for sharp teeth in the body of a maize plant or something, but you're assuming it'll be in the body. The prediction is that it'll be in the body of some powerful predator with that can run fast and catch antelope, and then yes, exactly that. Then each generation, or sort of continuously, I suppose, there's new information coming in. Are those genes helping the animals? Are they reproducing in the environment? Sometimes they'll be unlucky. A good set of genes that could have helped will just happen to get hit by an avalanche or something. And sometimes an unhelpful gene will not be eradicated because it happens to have been in a body that's otherwise doing well, or has happened to have wandered into a place with loads of food through just good luck. But on average, over time, these fuzzy, noisy predictions that we can sort of see the frequency of certain genes in a population as, they get updated and get more precise. And then you get creatures that are better and better suited to their environment until the environment changes, whereupon predictions become bad, and a new set of prediction the probability system starts working on that instead. So yeah, it absolutely is. It's a very slow, noisy, messy Bayesian system, but it is once again a Bayesian system.
Are you familiar with the book Darwin's Dangerous Idea by the late Daniel Dennett?
By the late Daniel Dennett. Very sad. Very sad. Well, yeah, he had a pretty great innings actually, but it is. Nonetheless, I'm sad that he died.
Me too. He's one of my favorite thinkers, and that's one of my favorite books. And it really opened my eyes to the ways in which part of understanding evolution is understanding that the way it's able to do so much is by, to use the Bayesian term, like taking the results and making new priors based on them. So that he gives the example of, everyone says an example of randomness would be, the idea of a bunch of monkeys typing on typewriters and the works of Shakespeare coming out. And that's completely unlikely. It would seem so random. And yet he does a demonstration that, let's take one line of Shakespeare. Let's let a bunch of monkeys type randomly. But every time they randomly get a letter in the right position, let's hold that and then run it again. And actually, it doesn't take that many iterations then to get that line of Shakespeare.
Iterations, no.
That's how these miracles of evolution happen. You also, in a slightly different context in your book, you give the example of a game of Wordle, where if I were just to take 5 random guesses or 6 random guesses at picking a 5-letter word, my chances are very slim. But if each time I make a guess, I get some information back of which letters are in the right position, it can only take, 2, 3, 4 times, and I've suddenly got the right answer.
Yeah, it's surprisingly how quickly you can update these information. I think I know we read very similar books, because I think you're wrong. I don't think that was Daniel Dennett. I think the phrase was, methinks it is somewhat like a whale, and I think it was from The Blind Watchmaker by Richard Dawkins, which I'm willing to bet any money you like that you have also read.
I'm tempted to take your bet because I entered this with pretty high confidence, but now I'm getting some new information from my conversation with you, which is making me doubt my priors, and I'm going to have to update them. And so maybe, well, I'll tell you what, I'll bet $1. I'll bet $1 that it's Dennett.
All right, let's do that.
And listeners will get back to you and let you know who won our little bet. I guess my final question for you is, I'm wondering if writing this book and really diving into the world of probability and of Bayes, how it's changed you or your approach to life. Has it? Do you look at the world in a particularly Bayesian way now, do you think, in any interesting ways?
Yes, I think it has brought to light some ways of thinking that I find much more elegant. Like, I think it is very easy to get into a mindset of, I think this thing is true or it is not true. And therefore, if some evidence comes in that says, I've said this thing is true, and some evidence comes in that says it's not true, I either have to reject the evidence or change my belief. And you get into these sort of dogged, I have to defend my belief, and it becomes, I have to dog it. Whereas with a Bayesian model, you can say, I think this thing is very likely to be true. It's 95% likely to be true, 99% likely to be true, but nothing's certain. And so I might think it's 99% likely that some political belief of mine is true. But if someone shows me evidence, I can say, well, that evidence changes my position somewhat. So now I think it's only 97% likely, or 94% likely, or whatever. And then if I see more evidence, I can slowly shift in a much more elegant and sort of graceful way. I can just say, okay, I will change my mind over time as new evidence comes in, rather than it is true or it isn't true, or it will happen, it won't happen. I feel it is both more elegant and also more sort of realistic. We know that we're not perfect epistemological machines. We know we get things wrong. We know we should change our belief with new evidence. And so this lets you do that in a more, and you don't have to be literally running Bayes' rule over everything, but just keep it in your mind that I had this sort of prior belief and then I got new information. I don't have to reject it. I don't have to throw it out. I can just go, okay, I can have less confidence in that now or more confidence and, move around like that. I like that attitude.
Well, it sounds like a healthier way to live. And if we could all do that, maybe we wouldn't be butting heads with each other all the time.
Yes.
Well, I think, Tom, though, that while I take your point that we should not have 100% certainty about anything, I do need to acknowledge that you are 100% right that it was Richard Dawkins in The Blind Watchmaker who talked about the the monkeys typing Shakespeare. And I was completely wrong. So I'm going to update my model now. I feel like we've had a nice demonstration of Bayesian reasoning right there.
we have, but also it updates me a little bit towards you having excellent taste in books.
Well, Tom, thank you very much for coming on the show. And it was a real pleasure talking to you.
Yeah, that was a lot of fun. Thanks very much.
That was Tom Chivers, author of the new book, Everything is Predictable. Pick up a copy at your favorite local bookstore. It's full of illustrations that will help make what we talked about today even more intelligible. If you enjoyed this episode, there are a few things you can do to show us some love. You can leave a rating or review on Apple Podcasts. You can also subscribe to my show, The Next Big Idea Daily. Every weekday, I invite the authors of the best new books to share their key insights in 15 minutes or less. It's like a mini masterclass that you can enjoy while walking your dog or brewing your coffee. Search for The Next Big Idea Daily wherever you get your pods or follow the link in the episode notes. Today's show was produced by Caleb Bissinger, sound design by Mike Toda. We can say with 100% certainty that we're glad to be part of the LinkedIn Podcast Network. I'm Michael Kovnat. Have a great rest of your week.